So we're on page, top of 115, last chapter. This last verse is the one I've talked about, and commentaries say the same thing. It's really pulling everything together, both in terms of the concept, but even more important in terms of the grounding and self-cultivation that's essential. He's really mapping it out here. One of the major themes in this passage we'll do tonight, which is 1, 2, 3, the first 4 double sections, double verses, is basically coming back to his teaching of non-duality. I know every time we mention that, people get a little nervous because it sounds like it's philosophically hard to wrap one's mind around, but it's just saying, essentially, it's all complete and whole within our nature, within our mind, and that differences of two, that one is something and one is the other, is a mistaken view. For example, he says the idea that living beings and Buddhas are two different entities is a dualistic view. The non-dual view is to say that Buddhas and living beings are potentials within a total existing frame, and that it's a continuum or a variation along the continuum of manifestation, cultivation, realization. So it's not as if they are two separate things. And then he says afflictions and bodhi are non-dual, meaning the confused state and the awakened state are again a function of use of mind and understanding and not fundamentally opposite. And he goes through some other ones too. Buddhas, living beings, afflictions and bodhi. Right. And the other one is the direct and the gradual. He says basically these are not two different schools or even two different dharmas. The dharma is one, non-dual, but according to different potentials and capacities, one approaches it directly and the other approaches gradually, but these are different in approaches but not fundamental difference in kind. So these are aspects of his non-dual teaching. There's many more, but that gives you... So tonight's passage is he's doing a contrast with the awakened nature and the confused nature, which is represented as Buddha nature, awakened, and then he represents it here as demon, and we should talk about this a little bit, because it's both metaphorical and it's technical. And so are the other one, the views here. These are both a kind of general statement, but they're also very specific. And getting both of these is very helpful. These are actually conceptual terms, concepts that are key, and not just sort of vague poetic sense of right and wrong. So that we'll just look at the verses here. The first, the true as it is essential nature is the real Buddha. Wrong views, the three poisons, enthrone a demon. Lost and confused, the demons own the house. Seeing true and straight, the Buddha's in the home. Wrong views, the three poisons, stirred up within the nature, just invite the demons to abide. Right views, true seeing, purges the three poisons, and the demon turns into a Buddha, for real, not false. So it's a very rich, thick passage here. So what I say, on one hand, he's saying our true nature, unobstructed, manifesting completely without attachment, without clinging, without akusala, which means unwholesome tendencies, that's the essential, that's the real Buddha. So our nature is essentially Buddha. But we can't enthrone, if you want to use the throne thing, so in this sense he talked about it earlier, then the Buddha is enthroned within, and I would say the home or the house here is referring to the person. It is the body, of course, but it's the person, the body-mind. And so this person or home or house that's referred to is us, the body-mind, and not something else. It's not a magical heavenly realm beyond someplace. And so he's saying basically whether home is occupied by an enlightened being, so to speak, that the king or the queen is this enlightened being that is in the driver's seat of our consciousness and our decision-making and clarity, that this is a benevolent ruler, so to speak, who is all-wise and knowing and kind and compassionate and not making mistakes and cause and effect. When this functioning is occurring within our house, within our home, that is the Buddha, let's use small b, on the throne, that our enlightened nature is now operative and functioning. However, if we have wrong views or indulge in wrong views and the three poisons, we switch out that king to a demon king, in a sense. And the demon king here is represented by the opposite, that which is akushala. The first I said kushala should be wholesome. Akushala is what is unwholesome, what is harmful, decentering, lost, confused, can be a kind of almost dis-ease, a constant feeling of being almost obsessively off base, even addicted almost to a pattern where you can see it happening but you can't sort of stop it. It's all forms of attachment, clinging, and when he says the three poisons, basically this is referring to anything that's motivated by craving, lust, greed, thirst, that which is also motivated by either aversion and hatred and anger, or the last one being not clearly seeing things as they are, which we would call, sometimes are manifest as greed, anger, or greed, aversion, and stupidity. These are the three poisons, but stupidity here isn't referring to IQ or your, whether you read the newspaper every day or something. This is referring to a fundamental misperceiving of the way things really are. And therefore, you can have people who are really smart that are stupid in this sense, possessed by that poison, and you can have people who are literate, like the Sixth Patriarch, who are not stupid. So this is a different use of the term stupid. It has to do with a sort of a moral discernment rather than intellectual acumen. So that's his first one. Now, wrong views could just mean you see things wrongly. You're just not clear. But I want to go into this a little more because it's actually more technical than that. But then he says he just the more poetical, lost and confused. He just says lost and confused. He uses this expression, which most of us can relate to, the feeling of at some time or another being lost and confused. He says when that is the case, then the demon owns the house. You are taken over and being directed by, quote, this demon, small d. The true seeing things really clear and thin, the Buddha is in the home. And so you could say the clear seeing is the Buddha, and the Buddha is a clear seeing. They're non-dual. When you are seeing clearly, unobstructed, without those wrong views, just that is Buddha. And Buddha is just the functioning of being able to see things clearly and not be clinging, attached, and confused. So it's just different ways. You could also say, in the non-duality here, then you see where he's going. He's just saying, basically, let's just do polarity. Demon is at one end here, and Buddha's at this end, along a continuum. They are not separate entities, but different functionings or manifestation of the same fundamental nature, just used differently, operating differently. So then, that they're non-dual, you could take a verse like, and I'm taking some liberty here, so please excuse me, but if one wishes to know all Buddhas of the 3 periods time, contemplate the nature of the Dharma realm, everything's made from mind alone. Substitute, if one wishes to know all demons of the 3 periods of time, contemplate the nature of the Dharma realm, everything's made from this mind alone. So it's interesting, in Chinese, 佛 is Buddha. And what's the tone for mo? 4th?
2nd?
Mo?
Mo. 2nd.
Yeah, so they're both 2nd tone. 佛 is Buddha, mo is demon. So you could say that the verse I have that one of my teachers wrote out for me is, it's 佛就是心, Buddha is just this mind. And you could put 魔就是心, demon is just this mind. And sometimes the teachers do this. It's one hand. And how fast does it go from Buddha to demon? No. It can go back and forth. So that's why he says on the previous page, Buddha is found right within your own mind, but so is demon found right within your own mind. And then he said, when you're awakened to your essential nature, living being is Buddha. Confused about your essential nature, Buddha is living being. Again, he's doing the non-duality here. And then he says very clearly, if your essential nature is balanced and centered, living being is Buddha. When your essential nature deviates, Buddha becomes living being. This is what he's saying here in the verse. He's just summarizing this, but he's using the word here, not living being, but now he's using demon. So again, the potential of a living beings. All living beings have the Buddha nature, and all living beings have the potential to be demons. So the demon nature. That nature, and that's why you have to be careful not to essentialize the nature and say, oh, it's some rendering of saying it's all good. You know, Buddhism is saying that human nature is all good. What it really is saying is it has this immense potential, this plasticity, to be really good, all the way up to really enlightened prajna paramita wisdom, but also demonically confused and off to the extreme. And you can see this both in human behavior, if you look at the different variations of people that are on the unimaginably worst dimension of human behavior, whether you're looking at war criminals or serial killers or, I mean, people that just do these atrociously horrible things. And then the opposite, just a stellar, altruistic, mind-numbing goodness that can come out of human beings. But it's along the spectrum. It's not like these are intrinsically good or intrinsically evil. It depends on how you use it. And that's why the text put a lot of emphasis on the word cultivation. It's not like it's predestined or ordained to go one way or the other. You cultivate it. If you cultivate it and refine it, it becomes something wholesome, pure, and begets better. And you don't, you neglect it, or worse, abuse it, it becomes the opposite. So the emphasis isn't on a fixed this or that, but rather a dynamic, working with it always, constantly. And that's why he says, if you stir up those 3 poisons, if they're stirred up and let go, if you don't call them out and curb them, then you invite the demons to abide. So it's very interesting. It's like, well, where do the demons come from? You invite them to abide. Again, this is poetic language, because you're generating these states of mind from within your own person. And then he says, the right view is true seeing purges the 3 poisons, and the poison then turns into the opposite, and the demon turns into Buddha, for real, not false. Now, for real, not false, I'm not so sure why he's saying this here, but I think partly it's for emphasis. It's exclamation, exclamation point. I'm telling you really how it is. And he's telling it how it is, not simply because it accords with the teachings in the text, but it also is something he's directly knowledgeable on and knows from his own experience. And that's what he's saying here. He's saying, yes, I'm not giving you misleading information here. I'm giving you the real thing. It's up to you to affirm it and figure it out for yourself. You're not going to just take it because I say it's true and real. But I'm telling you, I don't have any doubts about this. This is really how it works. So, anybody want to ask about that? And I wanted to go into the views a little bit. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, thanks. So, it seems to me, so if both ends, the Buddha end and the demon end, are in the same continuum, if they're in the same continuum, then it seems to me, and maybe this is where I'm wrong about it, but it seems to me that they have the same essence. And if that was true, how is it that one seems to reside in the realm of duality and the other in the realm of non-duality?
I missed your last point. The nature is said to be one and the same. It's not greater in ordinary living beings or less in, say, demons, and it's not less in Buddhas and greater than people and so on and so forth. It's of a singular quality. How it's used, how you manifest, how you work with it makes all the difference between it being one or the other. But it's the same essential nature that's being worked with here. So it has this immense elasticity or plasticity. And that's why it says, and the 10,000 things all come from this nature. Use it correctly, it's Buddha. Abuse it and use it incorrectly, it's a living being. Really abuse it and let it go, it becomes demonic and so on and so forth. Now, I didn't understand your question.
So how is it that the demonic resides in the realm of non-duality, or duality, sorry, and then the other end is in non-duality?
Non-duality is not a realm, but it's a misunderstanding of the way things are.
And how does that misunderstanding happen if it's the same essence?
Well, the question would be, how does a demon come from the same essence that the Buddha is? Right? It's not like duality and non-duality come from that essence. If you rightly understand and you're using the nature correctly, you see, all things are non-dual. And if you're not using it correctly, one of the wrong views, you start to see things as dualistic. And this is one of the views that you get. And when you start to see things as dualistic, then you go down the next thing and say, okay, so I'm here and that's there. And you start to get in some very specific views that are wrong because they don't lead to your understanding and liberation. They're not wrong because the Buddha said they're wrong. This is where I want to go here. So if I could, maybe this will become clear when I go into the actual listing, the technical listing of the wrong views, because it's important to understand when he says the wrong views, remember the verse says here, wrong views are 3 poisons and thrown the demon. So one of the wrong views is having a dualistic construct. Okay, so the dualistic construct would say, oh, I'm incapable of being enlightened. I need to have something from outside to save me. That's a dualistic construct, and that won't lead to liberation because then you're not cultivating yourself, you're waiting for Godot, so to speak. You get the idea? So that view becomes wrong because it leads you to a kind of paralysis of your own development. And that's why the view thing is very important. It's not just like, you're not looking at things clearly, that's a wrong view. This is a very specific list. So let me go into that and see if that helps address your question. So first of all, a view, this is drishti or diti in Pali, is an actual technical term. And it's not simply a kind of abstract collection of propositions, like, oh, the earth is square, or something like that. Rather, it's a charged, and I mean charged, mean emotionally and intellectually charged interpretation of experience, which then intensely shapes and affects everything we think, all our sensations and our actions. So this is like a paradigm almost, an oriented paradigm of perception and understanding that's charged, and it's through this that we understand and we sense and we feel and so it's not just kind of ideas that come and go, but this is sort of a basic charged interpretation of experience. And these views in turn, while they're that way, if not attended to and corrected, they in turn produce a kind of mental conditioning. And so conditioning has to be over time, they become habituated and no longer examined. So at first, maybe they were examined a little or not examined so closely. We just sort of, but over time, these become habituations. They become sort of almost like our worldview. But it's more, not just an overarching worldview, it's a psychological, emotional view too. And so over time, this conditioning hardens. And then what happens is, it's not, once it conditions and habituates, it's not just like we have neutral alternatives that we can dispassionately choose among. It's not like, well, let me think that over now. It's almost reflexive as it becomes. So in that sense, it becomes almost part of samskara or sanskara, because it's a formation. You following? So this is a sort of a cognitive emotional conditioning that begins with ideas and orientations or even impulses, but then unexamined, let go, it hardens and becomes a kind of mental conditioning. So some of the language that used is that these are inappropriate, subtle activities of mind. Mind stream formed from habitual patterns. This one I really like. It's a collapse. It's a collapsing the expanse of possibility or openness. This is really interesting. In other words, the mind that is open to look at things without holding to a narrow, myopic opinion, speculative view or something. What views are then is that they actually collapse consciousness and openness down to. And this is where then one of the views is to have an sort of extreme form of dogmatism that develops. And what you do is you have what you think is a superb focus on the truth, but the field has become now irrelevant, almost out of sight. So that, and over time, then with this you become argumentative, insistent, stubborn, and so forth, and new data cannot come in. Now, I'm not talking about new data like scientific data. I'm talking about honest, good criticism of yourself. What? You know, because when that data comes in, if your view is already, then you don't receive it. You collapse that down. And so then the result is you start to associate with people who reinforce your views rather than who challenge or rub them. And you can see a whole progression of sort of negative behavioral qualities that develop around these views. So it's a hardening. And it's not only a hardening, but it's a collapsing. So that's why I like that view. And sometimes it's said, basically, one way of looking at it is to say it's a setting up of a misunderstanding on the four, what are called four virtues of nirvana. In this way, and I'm sorry to be so technical, but it's good to get this out. There's a sense that nirvana is purity, permanence, true self, and bliss or joy. And so the four inversions or the four views have to do with mistaking what is impure as pure, mistaking what is not your true self for your true self, mistaking what is impermanent as permanent, and then mistaking what is fundamentally deep joy, liberated bliss for what is not. And so when you're in the view, collapsed consciousness or the collapsed openness, you then get views about this that don't lead to liberation, because either you're setting up your ego as your true self, or you're setting up attaching to things that are impermanent, trying to force them into a permanent mold, or so on and so forth. You get where this is going. So it's an intellectually formed wrong awareness that denies the existence of something that is necessary to understand, to attain liberation and enlightenment. This is really key to understand here. It's an intellectually formed, but then becomes emotionally habituated too. These lines between intellect and emotion are really not the way to look at these texts. They're talking about a continuum of the way the human mind works, and it thinks emotionally. I'm sorry, this Descartesian split that we do between mind and body and emotions is really a false dichotomy. Again, a dualistic construct that Well, because most of what we're doing when we're into views is maybe it began as an intellectual, emotional, but now it's completely become almost obsessively, formatively, emotionally attached. And this can happen with politics, it can happen with relationships and whatnot. And once that's there, this hardening is the view energy. And the let go, release your hold, you know, you look at Guanzuzai Bodhisattva, this kind of loose, relaxed, that's the physical, I say, imagery you want to have. And the opposite of that is a rigid, dogmatic, stiff, narrow, and correspondingly psychophysical circulatory tightness. Afflictions are not just mental states of irritation or disturbance. They manifest in your capillaries and your neurotransmitters and the whole physical spectrum. It comes across. So the mind-body thing here is really, really working. So that's what I want to say. But the key thing here is that they're wrong awarenesses that denies or pushes away the existence of something that's necessary to understand to attain liberation and enlightenment. This is the key. Why are they wrong? They're wrong because the Buddha said they're wrong. No. They're wrong because they are not attuning to what's necessary for liberation and awakening. That's why they're wrong. So in a sense, they're functionally wrong. They're pragmatically wrong, rather than, how shall I say it, dogmatically wrong, if that helps. So in this sense, they become laid down as wrong views in the same way, and they are, very interesting, part of klesha. So if you look at klesha, greed, anger, stupidity, jealousy, pride, you know, and so on and so forth, and wrong views, drishti. Well, wait a minute. So these are actually elements of human existence that obstruct or impede our awakening. That's the one of the key definitions of klesha is that which obstructs, impedes the awakening to the essential nature. So that's a functional kind of definition because they're not working. When the Buddha said, my goal in teaching is to end suffering, it's not to lay down a dogmatic religion of truth. So if it's aiming at the release and the ending of suffering, dissatisfaction, anxiety, and so forth, functionally working, that's what makes it dharma or dhamma. So in this sense, what impedes that is a wrong view. Now sometimes just emotions alone, negative emotions can impede it. Clinging, you know, stinginess, hoarding, debauchery, and so forth. But so can an intellectually wrong-formed idea, because the idea then leads to an orientation and action that then leads to the obstruction of attaining of awakening. So this is important. It's not just about feelings or emotions. This is really about having clear ideas about the way things are that, if you don't understand it in this way, will functionally mislead. Give an example. There are views that are off or wrong that are not drishti, false views. Anybody want to name some that are? In other words, whether you hold them or not won't obstruct. How many people here believe in the abominable snowman, Yeti? Nobody.
Can't rule it out.
Hey, there we go. And I'm going to say, oh, that's a wrong view. It's not a wrong view. It's not going to affect your liberation or attainment of awakening, whether you believe in the abominable snowmen or not, or the snow fairies, right? So in a sense, these are not charged in the same way that a attitude of there's a permanent self, me, that goes on forever no matter what. That's a wrong view, because that view will lead you to attachment and clinging and not to liberation. But whether you believe in an abominable snowman or not, okay, fine. I mean, I guess you could even believe the earth is flat or round, you know, and I don't know that that would necessarily be an obstruction to your liberation or enlightenment. Okay, so far so good? We okay? Some questions? There's always, go ahead.
I always feel like whether or not you believe in snow fairy is something that you can choose, and it's a factual thing that, you know, that I feel I probably have some kind of free will over, but whether or not the view that that there is a self and autonomous, you know, kind of perpetuates, and that idea, that view of a self, it's so ingrained that seemingly I can't really choose whether or not I continue to hold that view. Does that kind of make sense?
I was trying to find. The choosing, why do you stress the choosing? What is it about the choosing? Because from this point of view, we are responsible for the views we hold. Therefore, we have, in a sense, chosen them. It's not like they were genetically predetermined or necessarily forced on us. Now, I know a lot of you will object here. There's a lot of education that does amount to a kind of lack of choice. But ultimately, come on, there's some point all of us get to where you go, okay, I'm 13, I'm 14, I'm 16, I'm 30, it's time to call this into question. You still, at some point or another, choose to buy into it, even if at 3 and 5, you know, you're going, yes, there's abominable snowmen, I really believe them, but I choose, but what's your point about choosing? I'm not sure I understand it.
I guess it's that if I can choose to not attach to a notion of self, I would. But it's almost seemingly impossible for me to do that at this point. You know, like, it's almost like...
So I understand what you're saying now, I think a little better. We are responsible for the views that we hold. We're also responsible for questioning them. Whether you can liberate yourself from a tendency to view the self, me, as some permanent, abiding truth, which in fact, factually, doesn't hold up. But let me put that aside, okay? Because you mentioned, in fact, there's no fairies, but in fact, there's no self in that sense either. But factually, not just psychologically, I'm sorry. There's nothing in science that confirms, you know, an unchanging, immutable self that goes, but that being the case, all you're responsible for here in views is to be aware that the hold it has on you, and to be aware on it, to work on it, but not simply to succumb to it or even embrace it or even inflate it. So the view caution thing, just like greed and anger and stupidity, say, I know, I see, anger is absolutely wrong, and then boom, you explode. Okay, you know it's wrong, but that doesn't mean you lick it. The important thing about views is that you understand that this is a view that isn't leading to enlightenment and liberation. At the same time, you know that it has a powerful hold, and you have to work with that tension. But it's not the case that once you hear that this is a wrong view, you just let go of the view of self. It's that you have it in your compass as you're cultivating to be careful not to go down to that road and the states associated with that view. Does that make sense? It's not like it's just voluntary turn off, turn off. Obviously, these wouldn't be being mentioned if, in fact, they weren't deep habitual tendencies in living beings to formulate and to, I mean, this is what it means to be living beings, is those who are formed in these views and ecclesia. That's what a living being is. And so the whole point of the teaching is to work with where that is, to turn it back in some way or another, to untie these various knots. So these have to be presented as potential and real knots, even though it's really hard to necessarily break them or untie them. But if you don't lay out that groundwork in the theory, you might completely overlook these wrong views and continue to cultivate and not make any progress. I don't know if that makes sense. The other thing that's important here is in this way of teaching, when the Sixth Patriarch says, I simply untie knots and call it a teaching or samadhi or whatever, this to me is where it's not so much the concern with the content of these views or theories, the actual content of them, as with the psychological state that they produce or generate in those who hold them. You understand? It's not like the Buddha is saying the content of this view is erroneous and wrong, ex cathedra from my authority. He's saying it's not the content, it's the character of this view and what it produces in you that gets you into a state of a tied-up affliction and whatnot. It's the psychological effect that the holding of the view has, not the content of the view per se. This is really important because other people will say, oh, well, I thought Buddhism was very open and non-dogmatic, and here you have wrong views as a category like 10 Commandments. You have to really understand that's what's not being stated here. They're not being stated, they're not wrong because the Buddha said they're wrong. It's because Buddhas understand these don't lead to liberation that they caution against them as wrong. Maybe wrong would be misleading, would be a better term, because they're directionally vectors that are throwing you off the path. I mean, if you want to think of, we have to psychologically translate this because right, wrong can connote, at least in certain cultures, a kind of dogmatic, authoritarian construct of something. But here what it's saying, you have to always think functionally. Is this conducive to cultivating my person and gaining? Is it leading me or is it misleading me? So then wrong becomes, and I think deviant here has to do deviating off. We use the word off-center here. But it has this idea of, you know, you've lost balance, you've lost equilibrium, and therefore you're not treading solidly. I think we have to look at it functionally. Because I've heard this expression used almost in a judgmental way. You have wrong views, and you are sentenced to 10 years in the Avicii Hills. You know, no. It's meant to be descriptive rather than judgmental, and it's meant to be therapeutic rather than condemning. In other words, you know what? I just took your blood pressure and looked at your panel of blood things. We got some issues here we need to address. It's not like, you are sick, you sorry. No, you know, that's what I mean by therapeutic. And so you're looking at it in that way and asking, okay, so therapeutically it's wrong because it's going to lead to affliction, entanglement, and lack of clarity, and ultimately not awakening. But now to go into these, there's no time. And instead of that, I will go into them next week. And in case you have wrong views, hold on to them. Until next week, we'll look at them. But what I wanted to do tonight was something somewhat of a digression. And I'm sorry if I digress for you, but I'm not going to sing a song, so it's not going to digress to that degree. But what I like to do every once in a while, I like to acknowledge or honor people that have helped me in my cultivation. And they're not always necessarily, quote, Buddhist monks and nuns or even religious teachers. And you know over the years, I've shared poets and poetry with you because somehow poetry and poets inspire me. I think of Hui Neng as a poet. He's pushing language to the nth degree to where it almost loses its hold on meaning in a sense, but actually moves us towards a higher meaning because language is something that is intrinsically limited, but we use the limited to point to something that's more unlimited. And I think poetry does that very well sometimes. It works with language. So the poet I wanted to just mention tonight, and I won't take up a great deal of time, and I want to read maybe one or two of his poems as well, is the poet S.W. Merwin. And the reason I'm doing this is, and before the summer starts, I want to do another one of mine, Mary Oliver. Both Mary Oliver and S.W. Merwin passed away in the last couple months.
W.S. Merwin.
W.S. Merwin. William, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah, he hated Bill. Yeah, but then he hated William too, so he just went W.S. Merwin. And maybe sometime I'll talk about Mary Oliver as well. The reason I like Merwin. One, I think he's got his priorities straight, what he writes about. He's not what I would call a confessional poet, who's always just bearing his soul and talking about the inner traumas of his own development or whatnot. He was an environmental activist, an environmental poet. He won the Pulitzer Prize twice. I believe he's a 2-time recipient. And he just died this March 15th at his home in Haiku, Hawaii. Very interestingly named. It's on the island of Maui. And he was 91. And it just seems I'm losing a lot of 90-year-old friends. Merwin wasn't my personal friend, but there's people that you read that you go away feeling we're friends, even though you maybe never met them. And Merwin was one of them. But he also considered himself a Buddhist. He called himself a Buddhist. And you can see in his writing, one person noted that he used language to conjure up absence, silence, and nothingness, often drawing on themes of the natural world, spirituality, his personal history, but also a kind of optimism in the face of the impermanence of life. It's a really interesting. The thing I like about him is a couple things. One, I want to say that he took this piece of property in Maui that was actually devastated. It's right out of Mencius's Cow Mountain. If you are familiar with that passage of Cow Mountain where he talks about a denuded and degraded landscape that used to be almost paradisical, and now it's been ruined by grazing and sheep and cultivation and strip mining and so forth. And then Mencius compares it to our nature, that although we may be in that position, having been strip mined and whatnot, we weren't essentially there to begin with, non-dual, and that it can return. That you can take a polluted, degraded environment, and if you nurture it and keep out the bad influences, it can return. And you can also take a paradise and then turn it into a hell with the opposite. So as we talk about Buddha, demon, living beings, enlightened, we can also talk about nature and dystopian scenarios along the same continuum. So he got this property because he was a poet and he didn't have any money. Sorry, this is not a pitch for a career. What does Rilke say? Unless you can not live without writing poetry, become a poet. Otherwise, don't. But not even native plants would grow on this property that he acquired. It had been deforested for firewood to fuel the whaling ships that anchored out of the island. And then it was used for grazing land by the settlers who stayed behind, really matching Mencius's Cow Mountain piece. Sugarcane fields were planted when the cattle refused to graze, furling their lips to protest the wild grasses, but it was pineapple growers who really wrecked the valley. Because of the way they planted their pineapples up and down instead of along hillsides, all the topsoil washed away. And after decades of abuse, each chronicling a different period in Hawaii's history, the land had been leached on the northern coast of Maui so much that even native plants would grow. And Merwin tried first to replant in the 70s when he acquired this property, the native plants, and they wouldn't grow. So not only was, metaphorically, not only was the fruit not able to grow, the very soil itself. So I'm also thinking of one of my favorite poets is Tao Yan Ming, who in his poem, The Return, says, "I'm going home. My fields and gardens are choked with weeds. Why should I not return?" And when he says fields and gardens, but it also can be the very soil won't support even native plants anymore. But that doesn't mean the soil can't be. Okay. And so one of the poems, if I have time tonight, is this poem that he wrote towards the end called Place. But the poem starts, "On the last day of the world, I would want to plant a tree." This is how he begins his poem. And what's really cool about this, first of all, I want you to just sort of pick up on his language. His language is not T.S. Eliot. It's not intellectually ornate language. It's very simple. In fact, if you look at this, Those first two lines I just read to you, every one of them is monosyllable. On the last day of the world, I would want to plant a tree. All monosyllables. Yeah. And so what's interesting about it, for 40 years while he was there, he planted a tree every day. So it's very interesting. On his last poem, he expresses it that way. And he restored 19 acres of land in haiku, even if it seemed to him, and this is one of his other themes, the world itself might well be ending. First from military conflict, and then from ecological crisis. So if you want to see, there's a wonderful documentary of him, and I think it's titled "Though the World is Burning." And it's one of his poems too, but he says, in the spite of the brutality that we wreak upon the environment, that we, with our greed and our money and our acquisitiveness, that we, even still, you can do small things in places to counterpoise, to counterbalance this. Don't let it completely destroy you, and don't think you have to completely overturn it. But do what you can in small ways, and that's what he did with this piece of property in Maui. And it's really interesting. The other thing he does is he deals with self, which I was talking about as one of the views, but he does it in a poetic way. If you read his poems, you'll get a sense of a tenuous sense of self in him. He's there, but he's not really asserting himself. He's not saying I. And there's always a hint of, he's floating almost somewhere between heaven and earth, between underground and over, and between here and present and not. And he says in his poetry, that's exactly where the self belongs. Somewhere in this indeterminate, tenuous, and goes back to the view thing I mentioned tonight, not where your openness has collapsed, but your openness and therefore vulnerability is always available to you. And he said if you live in this way, you are very close to what it means to be fully human and spiritual. So let me read you this one poem. On the last day of the world, I would want to plant a tree. What for? There's no punctuation, so I have to, it's like original Chinese text, I have to add the punctuation here. Not the fruit. What for? Not the fruit. The tree that bears the fruit is not the one that was planted. So he's saying, I want to plant a tree on the last day of the world, I want to plant a tree, but not a fruit tree. What for? Not the fruit. What for? In other words, what he's saying, not for instrumental value, not for reward, not because we're going to get, but for its own sake. In other words, I want to have a relationship with nature that's not exploitative, that this exists for me, that I am the master and conqueror of nature, but I would plant a tree that isn't done for this reward payoff. I want the tree that stands in the earth for the first time, with the sun already going down and the water touching its roots, in the earth full of the dead and the clouds passing one by one over its leaves. So you see earth and sky. You have earth, which is the roots and the dead, and you have the sky, which is the leaves and the clouds, and they're intersecting, they're interrelated. From the roots and the dead comes the new thing that reaches up to the sky. And basically, I think partly what he's saying here is not only did he plant these trees and love them, but it's somehow a tree can teach us how to live in the world, somehow interconnected with, and again, not clearly the self as it departed from the roots, the earth, the sky, and the clouds. Anyhow, I really love his sense of who is it? Jeffers, the Carmel poet, Robinson Jeffers, tells, he has this poem called Carmel Point, which I'll read some other time, but he says, we have to uncenter ourselves a bit. In other words, get out of a human-centric and become decentered, not in the Buddhist sense of being off balance, but actually closer to what the Buddhist sense, even though he's using uncentered, to be integrated back into something more whole rather than human-centric. So this is one thing. The next one I like, and I'll just read it and then I'll close tonight. It's a short one. And I think it has a lot of Buddhist theme, attending to the here and now. Sixth Patriarch says, a frantic passage through life ends in bitter regret. But I also like this because of the dog. So I have to tell you, my relationship with the dog that I spend the summers with in Maine is very much along these lines. And the dog, in its own way, and I don't get too stretched out here, is a kind of good and wise advisor. But let me just read the poem. This is called Turning, which is very interesting. Turning. I'm going home, my fields and gardens. So it has a transformative, the very language here. Here's how the poem reads. Going too fast for myself. I missed more than I think I can remember. Let me read that again. Going too fast for myself. I missed more than I think I can remember. Almost everything, it seems sometimes. And yet, there are chances that come back. And yet, there are chances that come back that I did not notice when they stood where I could have reached out and touched them. This morning, the black Belgian shepherd dog, still young, looking up and saying, "Are you ready this time?" When I'm up in Maine, I might have my books and whatnot, and all of a sudden there's a splash in the water or something moves in the trees, and the dog immediately picks up and says, "That's the action right now," and then looks back to me, "Are you ready? Are you ready to put down your books and things? Let's go and explore and check this out." So, but also it has this really wonderful notion of kind of regret that I'm living too fast. My life is going too fast, and I missed more than I think I can remember. I'm going too fast for myself, not too fast for somebody else. I'm not at my own speed. I'm not at the speed I need to be to feel myself and live in my body, so to speak. I'm actually going too fast. I'm outside my own skin. And then he says, yet almost everything, it seems sometimes, is more than I think I can remember. I missed everything, almost everything. And yet there are chances that come back. And he says the chances come back, and they came back because, in a sense, I didn't notice them when they stood right before me to begin with. And sometimes I feel it's this way with a retreat or cultivating the way or attending to some stirring of your spiritual nature. It stands right before you. It's right there. And then you just ignore it. You don't attend to it. Yet, if you're lucky, it comes back again like the Belgian dog and says, "Are you ready this time?" So anyhow, I wanted to share some of my appreciation of W.S. Merwin on his passing. And I got an email from you to the extent of saying, he is gone, but we have his poems and his words.
Me too.
Yeah.
And Terry Gross played a rebroadcast of an interview she did with Merwin 9 years ago as he was publishing one of his final volumes. It's very good. I'll email it to you.
Oh, and this reminds me of one thing I want to say about his Buddhism. Because I just, as you were talking, Ellen, I remembered this. Early on when he was interested in Buddhism in the 70s, when many of us got involved, it wasn't clear where to go to and who to study with. And Merwin ended up with his, I think it was his fiancée at the time, going to study with Trungpa in Europa. And when he got there, part of the initiation was this Halloween party where there was a lot of drugs and booze, and the insistence that everybody come naked and dance in front of this fire for Trungpa. And Merwin is the son of a Presbyterian minister from the East Coast. I mean, he wasn't, like super uptight, but stripping down and doing this was just appalling to him, and he couldn't figure out what this has to do with Buddhism or awakening or spiritual or anything. So he saw where this was going, and he and his fiancée went back to their cabin and stayed there. And then they were sent to come out, and they refused to come out. They weren't going to join this. And they locked the door. And then the pressure increased. He sent his heavies, and they basically broke down the door and dragged them out and stripped them of their clothes in front of this open thing. And they were just, one of the reports was they were just sitting there sort of shivering and cuddling next to each other at this embarrassment and whatnot. And so, and this is from Merwin's own account. And then it ended, they went, and he sent her away because he didn't want her to be even close to this again, but he stayed because he wanted to confront Trungpa and ask, what is this? And he was told by the people there that this is called crazy wisdom. This is how an enlightened master works. And so he confronted Trungpa and he said, I understand you think this is crazy wisdom and whatnot. Is it possible, though? Is it possible that maybe you were a little mistaken last night? And Trungpa's immediate response is, I'm enlightened, I can't make mistakes. And then Merwin said he turned and he left and never turned back. And to me, that's wisdom. Merwin had the wisdom. The other was crazy. But his good roots somehow allowed him to see through that. Even though it could have been, for a lot of people, it's very mystifying. This is presented as being a great enlightened master and so forth. And he never went back. To the end, he really got into doing Chan or Zen sitting meditation, and he would do 2 45-minute periods every day, 45 minutes before breakfast and 45 minutes before his dinner, and planting 1 tree a day. And I was thinking, that's not a bad way to do it. Mm-hmm. You know, 2 45-minute sits in the day and planting a tree, one could do worse. So that's some of the stories about his Buddhism. I know some of you are thinking, how could that happen? But that's kind of some of the stuff. And it's not over with, by the way. These kinds of shenanigans are still going on in various places. So beware.
Trump, he was an alcoholic. He had crazy parties going on there. It was nothing to do with Buddhism.
You, with your grounded common sense, say it has nothing to do with it. But a lot of people are confused and I would say mystified by that and think because it's out of the bounds of the ordinary, it's extraordinary, therefore the manifestations. I would say very clearly, it's not the case that bodhisattvas can't make mistakes, but they're very careful not to make mistakes. And if you think you can't make mistakes, that's the beginning of stupidity. And so be very careful about this. If you meet really good teachers and whatnot, they'll never actually ever say, they couldn't say if they're really great teachers, I can't make mistakes. That's the language of a fool. It's also a wrong view in terms of cause and effect, because now you know. But I would say more what you'll find is people that say, I'm very careful that I don't make mistakes. I'm quick to try to catch them when I do. I appreciate it when you point it out, and I really try to change them. That's probably someone you'd like to draw near to. But someone who says, I can't, already has made probably the biggest mistake you could make. So, that being said, we'll do the transfer. Oh, you have announcements? Yeah, sure. Sorry, I went over again. It's funny, I go over and we don't finish.
So tomorrow, like always, 7:30 p.m., we have Avatamsaka lecture by Rev Heng Sher, who will speak from Australia. We'll be live streaming here. And on this coming Tuesday, it will be the first day after winter retreat when our friends from Abhayagiri Monastery will come, probably Ajahn Karunadamo or Ajahn Naniko, the new co-abbots. They start 5 p.m. and our dining hall is tea and Dhamma time, and until 6:30. And from 7:30 p.m. will be the meditation transmission 5 precepts and the Dhamma reflections. So, okay. It will be. This is happening. So from this April to the December will be once a month, first Tuesday each month. So for more information, you can go for the website in Abhayagiri or in our website berkeleymonastery.org.
Our minds as one. share the fruits of peace, with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light break the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassion